Welcome to Despicable Main Deep Dives. Today on the show,
How Google is nothing more than a thief.
We're jumping into some material today that really unpacks a major shift coming from Google, a pretty fundamental change in how they track users that, well, it reaches far beyond just your web browser.
yeah, that's right. And the sources we've been looking at, they actually point to a specific date when this is expected to start rolling out.
A date. When are we talking?
February 16th, 2025. So,
Wow. Okay, that puts a definite timeline on something that, like you said, could fundamentally alter how your digital activity is monitored.
exactly. And our sources, we've got various articles, some research notes. They detailed this shift and, importantly, its potential wide-ranging implications. It's quite a bit to unpack.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive really is to get to grips with what's actually happening here. We need to understand the core technology, the thing enabling this expansion. I think it heavily involves something called digital fingerprinting.
That's the key, yeah.
Yeah.
Digital fingerprinting is central to this.
Okay, so we need to understand that.
What we need to understand is how they're going to abuse this technology and how you are going to be a commodity for Google.
We'll explore Google's stated reasons for making this change, their side of the story. But crucially, we also need to dig into the significant privacy concerns that are being raised.
By experts, by regulators. It's not going unnoticed.
Right. And we want to place all this within the broader context, the digital ecosystem, the value of user data, the regulatory environment, all of that. Ultimately, we want to figure out what this could mean for you, the person navigating this increasingly complex digital world.
Because, let's face it, while some of the underlying tech might sound a bit arcane, maybe, the effects touch on something very personal.
Definitely. Your privacy, your autonomy online, how your information is used as you just, move between different devices throughout your day, phone, TV, laptop.
Yeah, all of it.
Okay, let's dive in then. The first big thing our sources highlight is just the sheer scope of this shift. It's moving well beyond just tracking activity within Chrome, which is what I think most people associate with Google tracking.
That's the historical focus, absolutely. Cookies, Chrome, web browsing. But this is different. The core of the change, as described in the material, is a significant expansion of Google's tracking capabilities.
See, Google can't steal your data with cookies anymore because everybody has these wondrous plugins, so they had to figure out another way to steal your data. But this theft is different. They want to make sure they can steal everything and you can't do nothing about it forever. So let's examine how this data theft is going to work, and I'm going to show you how to protect yourself from it as well.
Well, the sources indicate Google intends to track users across all their devices, not just the browser.
Across all devices, that feels huge, a really big leap. What kind of devices are we talking about specifically? Are there examples?
Yeah, the sources provide concrete examples. They explicitly mention things like smart TVs.
Okay, your television.
Right. Gaming consoles, think PlayStations, Xboxes.
Right.
And of course, smartphones, tablets, the devices most of us use constantly. The goal seems to be connecting your activity dots, across this entire ecosystem.
So whether you're browsing, streaming a show, playing a game, it all gets linked.
That appears to be the objective, based on the material.
Again, this is because Google is nothing more than a thief.
Creating a unified profile across platforms.
And this isn't some far-off hypothetical. You mentioned the date already.
Exactly. The sources are quite specific. This cross-platform, cross-device tracking approach is expected to start rolling out from February 16, 2025.
So this theft has already started. Do you know about the theft yet?
The sources also add an interesting layer of context here, suggesting this move isn't happening in a vacuum, but maybe follows some external pressure.
Yes, the material does note that. It mentions this development comes after pressure from the U.S. government, particularly around aspects of Google's Chrome browser business.
Okay, so maybe a reaction to that pressure.
So this is pressure from a government that's been hijacked by a fucking foreign power, the synagogue of Satan.
While it might be a response to one set of issues, the way Google is reportedly implementing this new strategy introduces new privacy concerns.
Ah, so solving one problem maybe, but creating another, or at least a different kind of problem.
That's how it's presented, yeah. A response that, in addressing one challenge, potentially generates others from a user privacy standpoint.
So this theft is endorsed by the government.
It sounds like a pivot, maybe under pressure, that could have unintended or perhaps intended side effects for privacy.
That's certainly a perspective raised in the material.
And one immediate implication mentioned is something about ad targeting becoming less strict outside of Chrome.
Correct. The sources indicate that one consequence of moving towards this new cross-device tracking method is that Google will reportedly be, well, less strict about targeting advertisements on platforms beyond the traditional web browser environment.
And they specifically mentioned smart TVs there.
Yes, smart TVs were explicitly cited as a place where this shift in ad targeting might become noticeable.
Okay, so let's recap the shift. It's significant. Expanding tracking across your entire digital life, phone, TV, game console, the works, connecting all that activity. And it's set to start rolling out early 2025.
That's the picture painted by the sources, yes.
The key question then becomes, how? How is Google planning to actually do this, especially if traditional cookies are becoming less effective or facing more scrutiny?
Right. And that brings us neatly to the core technology that seems to be powering this expansion. Section 2 in our material details this. Digital fingerprinting.
Digital fingerprinting. Okay, this sounds like the crucial mechanism.
It seems to be, yes. This is the primary technique the sources identify as being heavily utilized, perhaps even sort of reintroduced in a more central role, by Google for this cross-device strategy.
All right, walk us through it then. Based on the sources, how does this digital fingerprinting actually work? What is it doing under the hood?
So it's a method that relies on collecting very specific, often quite granular details about a device's software configuration and its hardware setup.
Okay, so it's looking at the device itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it less like putting a single tag on you, like a cookie file, and more like collecting a unique set of characteristics from your device.
What kind of characteristics? What specific details are we talking about? What information points get collected to build this fingerprint?
The sources give several examples. Things like the precise version of your operating system, not just Windows or Mac OS, but the specific build.
Right, the detailed version number.
Yes, the specific type and version of your web browser, even if you're not actively browsing at that moment. Your screen resolution, your display settings.
Screen resolution, how unique can that be?
Well, maybe not on its own, but it adds to the picture. And even, interestingly, the list of installed fonts on your device.
Installed fonts. Seriously, that seems like such a random detail.
It does sound random, doesn't it? But that's kind of the point.
Okay, so you have OS version, browser details, screen settings, fonts. These sound like fairly standard technical details in isolation. How do these disparate points combine to create a unique profile? I mean, surely lots of people use, say, Windows 11 with Chrome and a standard 1080p screen.
That's the crucial part of fingerprinting and where it gets powerful or maybe concerning, depending on your view. It's not just about one or two data points. It's about the combination of many seemingly ordinary details. So while millions might use Windows 11 and Chrome, the probability of two devices having the exact same specific build number of Windows 11, running the exact same minor version of Chrome, with the exact same list of browser extensions enabled, connected to a display with maybe a slightly non-standard resolution or color depth setting, and having the exact same set of, say, 350 fonts installed, including any custom ones or variations installed by other software.
Okay, I see where this is going when you layer all those seemingly small variations together.
Exactly. The combination becomes unique, or at least highly distinctive, very quickly. By combining dozens, maybe even hundreds, of these data points about the device's specific configuration, a highly distinct profile of fingerprint is generated.
Now, if this has creeped you out so far, don't worry. At the end of this video, I'm going to show you what you can do to protect yourself.
So it's this amalgamation, the specific mix of settings and software that allows companies to identify a specific device.
That's the mechanism described. And by extension, it often allows them to identify the user of that device across different platforms and services, even without relying on traditional persistent identifiers like cookies. It's like building a signature from the inherent characteristics of your hardware and software setup.
Okay, that makes sense. It's building uniqueness from non-unique parts. So this unique signature identifies the device. How does that differ fundamentally from cookies, which is the tracking method most of us are more familiar with? And why is fingerprinting viewed as, well, more concerning?
The primary difference, and this is heavily emphasized in the sources, lies in user control.
See, Google can't stand that you as a user have any sort of control because they're a thief and they're going to figure out a way to steal your data no matter what.
Traditional tracking cookies are, relatively speaking, pretty straightforward to manage.
Sure.
Most web browsers have built-in settings. You can view your cookies, you can block certain types, you can clear them all out with a few clicks.
Right, I can go into my settings, hit clear browsing data, check the cookies box, and boom, they're gone. Or supposed to be.
Precisely.
And this is something a thief like Google cannot tolerate.
But fingerprinting is significantly harder for the average user to even detect, let alone understand, block, or erase.
Harder to detect and block. Why?
Because it's not based on a file stored on your device that you can just delete. It's generated dynamically by observing the characteristics your device and browser naturally expose when they connect to a website or service.
So clearing my cookies or browser history won't actually get rid of the fingerprint.
That's the key point highlighted in the material. These fingerprints can remain intact and continue to identify a device even after users attempt to erase their digital traces.
How I figured this out is I reformatted my computer, all brand new, went to YouTube, and somehow YouTube knew exactly who I was without even logging in. How creepy is that fucking shit?
Clearing history, cookies, using incognito or private browsing modes.
Wait, hang on. So I could go into my settings, delete everything I think is tracking me, maybe use private mode, and this fingerprint is still potentially there identifying my device anyway. That's unsettling.
It is unsettling for many, yes.
Feels like trying to wipe your footprints online, but your device itself has this invisible, indelible mark. You can't just scrub it off.
That's a good way to put it. That's the core concern raised. Because the fingerprint is derived from the fundamental configuration of your device, things it needs to communicate anyway. It's not stored like a simple cookie. It's generated on the fly.
Has anybody figured out how they plan to use this technology in the future? I'll let you stew on it and tell you at the end.
This makes it far more persistent and difficult for users to counteract using standard privacy tools that were mostly designed with cookies or browser data in mind.
And have regulators picked up on this distinction? Are they aware of this challenge?
Oh, absolutely. The sources specifically reference the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. They're a major data protection regulator.
And what's their take on fingerprinting?
Their view, as noted in the material, is that techniques like digital fingerprinting fundamentally undermine user control over their personal data and online activity.
Undermine user control. That phrase really lands, doesn't it? It implies that your ability to decide how your data is collected, or maybe more importantly, your ability to effectively opt out, is significantly reduced.
That's the strong implication, yes.
Maybe even eliminated for this type of tracking. It feels like creating that digital signature for your device that you just can't easily get rid of, making it incredibly challenging to avoid being identified as you move from app to app, service to service, device to device.
And why would they need to go this far? Keep in mind, though, the data centers that they're building right now. Suppose that has anything to do with it?
That lack of straightforward user control, that persistence, is arguably one of the most significant privacy implications highlighted by the sources when discussing fingerprinting.
Okay, so we're getting a clear picture. We understand what's happening broader cross-device tracking starting soon. We understand how it's likely being done using this hard-to-avoid digital fingerprinting. But if this technique raises such significant privacy red flags, what's Google's official story? Why are they doing this? Section 3 in our material covers Google's rationale.
Right, Google does offer a few key explanations, as presented in the source material. Their primary justification seems to center around advancements in what they refer to as PTs.
PTs.
Privacy-enhancing technology.
Privacy-enhancing technologies. Okay, that sounds almost paradoxical when we're talking about enabling more pervasive tracking. How does that work?
Of course, Google is doing it to protect your privacy. How fucking lame is that? They can't even come up with a good excuse why they're stealing your data. So they use the exact opposite excuse of why they're stealing your data. What group of people on planet Earth routinely do this?
It does sound counterintuitive, doesn't it? But Google claims that these advancements in PTs are precisely what makes this shift not only possible, but also in their framing, necessary and potentially even beneficial for privacy in today's complex digital world.
Beneficial? How?
It's beneficial to the terrorists that have hijacked the United States.
They state that these technologies allow businesses, particularly the advertisers who, fund a lot of the free online content and services, to reach their target customers without violating user privacy.
Right.
That's the claim.
So Google's argument is that their new approach, powered by PETs and perhaps utilizing fingerprinting data in some aggregated way, is somehow designed to maintain or even enhance privacy standards while still allowing targeted advertising to function.
That is their stated hope and the rationale they put forward, according to the sources.
That's quite a fucking rationale, ain't it?
They assert these changes aim to create a safer and more secure environment for advertisers. That's one goal, while, in parallel, purportedly maintaining privacy standards for users.
Is anybody else laughing hysterically right now?
How do they claim to maintain privacy?
They specifically claim that their advanced algorithms can effectively anonymize or aggregate the user data derived from these techniques. The idea is to group users into cohorts with similar interests based on the data, rather than targeting specific individuals directly. Safeguarding individual identities is the promise.
Okay, anonymizing data collected via a method designed to uniquely identify a device.
Bullshit.
That sounds like a really significant point of tension. We'll definitely need to circle back to that when we discuss the skepticism around this.
It's a core point of debate.
Google also apparently claims this new system will give users more control over their data.
Bullshit.
That also seems to run counter to the nature of fingerprinting we just discussed.
Yes, providing users with more control is also part of their stated justification mentioned in the source material, however counterintuitive it might seem based on the technology itself.
All right, so besides the PTT's angle, what else? Do they point to market reasons?
They do. Beyond the technology claims, Google also points to the evolving digital landscape and the needs of advertisers as another key driver for this change.
Bullshit. From my perspective, it has nothing to do with advertising at all.
How do advertiser needs and sort of our changing user behavior fit into their reasoning?
Well, the sources explain that Google attributes the increasing demand for more sophisticated cross-device tracking methods to the fundamental shift in how people use technology today.
I'm going with it's all about control.
Like we discussed, people aren't just browsing the web on a desktop anymore.
Right, we're spread out. Phones, tablets, TVs, consoles, smart speakers, wearables. The list keeps growing.
Exactly. Our digital lives are fragmented across this whole constellation of devices. And advertisers, from Google's perspective as presented in the sources, need to be able to follow that user journey. They need to track interactions across this diverse array of devices.
Why do they need to do that?
Primarily to accurately measure the effectiveness of their advertising campaigns.
That's a good one.
They want to understand if, say, an ad someone saw while playing a game on their console actually led to them buying the product later on their smartphone. That cross-device attribution is crucial for them.
Okay, so Google is framing this move partly as a necessary evolution. They're saying, look, users behave this way now across many devices, and advertisers need to keep up to measure their results, so we're providing the tools.
Does anybody really believe that shit?
It's presented as responding to the market.
I'm going with they're responding to what the terrorists want that have hijacked the United States.
That's a significant part of their public explanation, yes, as reported in the sources.
Yeah.
Positioning it as a vital adaptation to the contemporary digital environment and the requirements of the businesses that rely on targeted advertising to reach potential customers.
All right, so we've heard Google's side. PETs promising privacy, algorithms anonymizing data, claims of more user control, adapting to the market, meeting advertiser needs across devices.
And what the terrorists want that have hijacked the United States.
But now let's shift gears. Section 4 gets into the counterarguments, the skepticism, and the really significant privacy implications from the perspective of users, experts, and regulators.
And this is where the picture becomes considerably more critical. Many voices, as detailed extensively in the sources, argue that despite Google's carefully worded claims, this move, particularly the heavy reliance on digital fingerprinting, represents a significant step backwards for user privacy, not forwards.
A step backwards. Why is there such widespread skepticism, especially around those claims of anonymity and increased user control in this new system?
Probably because most people see through the bullshit and know exactly what Google's all about. They're a fucking thief.
The skepticism, as articulated by privacy experts and advocates cited in the source material, seems to stem directly from the inherent nature of fingerprinting itself. They argue that the promises of effective anonymity ring hollow when the underlying technology is specifically designed to uniquely identify a device based on its distinct characteristics.
Because identification is the whole point of the technology.
Precisely. And beyond that, the technology is inherently complex. It often operates invisibly to the user. And, as we've discussed, it's incredibly difficult for the average person to manage or even fully understand. How can you consent to or control something you don't know is happening or can't easily stop?
So the very difficulty in detecting and blocking fingerprinting makes those claims of anonymity or user control feel, well, disingenuous to critics.
That's the core criticism highlighted, yes. The sources state that due to the stealthy, often background nature of fingerprinting, users frequently remain largely unaware of the extent to which their data is being collected and utilized via this method as they move across their different devices. It operates below the surface of conventional privacy settings people are used to managing.
Which loops back directly to user control, or rather, the profound lack of it that we touched on earlier.
Exactly. This new form of tracking creates a situation that, according to the sources, is incredibly hard to avoid.
And this is exactly why I'm going to tell you how to avoid it by the end of this video.
The material explicitly states that users won't have the same level of control over this type of persistent device-based tracking as they might have had or thought they had with cookie-based methods.
And the sources say it's described as being more difficult to opt out.
Significantly more difficult, yes. That phrasing appears consistently.
More difficult to opt out. That sounds like a very polite euphemism. It could mean there might not be any truly effective, user-friendly way to opt out available, especially compared to just clearing your cookies.
There is an effective way. It's called spoofing.
That is the strong implication drawn in the source material, yes. For privacy-conscious individuals, this fundamental difficulty in avoidance, coupled with the perceived lack of meaningful control, are explicitly termed troubling issues within the sources.
The language used in the sources describing the user's potential vulnerability here sounds quite strong, too. It's not just inconvenient, it's potentially harmful.
It does use strong language. The sources conclude that because fingerprinting effectively bypasses standard user-managed privacy controls, like cookie settings or private browsing modes, it renders users more vulnerable to surveillance and data exploitation.
Did anybody hear the key word there?
More vulnerable. How?
It essentially opens a door for tracking that users might have thought was closed by taking conventional privacy precautions. It potentially exposes more of their cross-device activity profile than they realize or consent to.
And despite Google's explanations about PTs and anonymization, have regulators just accepted this at face value?
Not at all, according to the sources. They make it quite clear that Google has yet to fully address the significant privacy concerns that continue to be raised by regulators regarding these tracking practices, especially fingerprinting. There remains an active tension and ongoing dialogue, perhaps even disagreement, between the company and regulatory bodies over these methods.
Okay, so summing up the user and expert perspective presented in the sources, Google's explanation feels insufficient to many. The core technology, fingerprinting, is hard to understand, very hard to avoid, potentially increases user vulnerability, seems to offer very limited practical control, and regulators still aren't satisfied. It certainly paints a picture where true recourse against this form of tracking feels severely constrained for the individual user.
That summary accurately reflects the perspective articulated across the source material regarding the privacy implications. It's a significant concern.
Stepping back a bit from the immediate technical details and the user impact, Section 5 in our notes puts Google's move into a broader context. It looks at the digital ecosystem as a whole, and specifically how user data is treated within it.
Yeah, this is important. What's key to understanding this move, as highlighted by the sources, is seeing it not just as an isolated technical change by one company, but as a reflection of deeper, more fundamental trends within the digital world.
And those sources point pretty directly to user data being increasingly treated as, well, as a product, a commodity.
Absolutely. The source material is quite explicit about this. It states that user data has become an increasingly commodified asset within the digital ecosystem. It's viewed, collected, processed, and often traded much like a raw resource.
Collected on a massive scale.
On a massive scale, yes. And then processed for various purposes, but primarily, as we know, for targeted advertising.
Which brings us right back to the role of advertisers in driving this whole system.
Precisely. The sources reiterate that advertisers form a fundamental pillar of the modern online economy. They pay for the free services many of us use. And they rely heavily on precise, detailed user data.
Why the reliance on precise data?
To tailor their strategies effectively. To target ads to the right audiences, optimize their campaigns based on what works, and crucially, measure their return on investment. They need to know if their ad spending is actually leading to results.
I'm going where the government is going to be given this data when they get their AI control grid in fucking place. What do you think?
This dependence on granular data makes sophisticated tracking techniques, especially those that can connect activity across multiple devices like fingerprinting, seem essential for their business success.
So it creates this powerful incentive structure, right? The commercial value placed on detailed user data fuels the advertising model, which in turn creates a huge demand for ever more effective, pervasive tracking methods, like cross-device fingerprinting. It sounds like a self-reinforcing loop.
The sources actually describe this as contributing to what some commentators term a cycle of surveillance.
A cycle of surveillance.
Yeah.
AI surveillance grid being built, and how are they going to use this data? They're going to be fucking tracking you everywhere you go with it. This is the fucking plan.
Where the continuous collection, analysis, and subsequent sale or utilization of vast amounts of user data have become incredibly lucrative for the major tech companies that facilitate it. The implication drawn clearly in the material is that this immense profitability can create an environment where business imperatives, revenue generation, potentially prioritize profit over privacy.
Prioritizing profit over privacy. That framing is certainly powerful. It suggests that the underlying economic incentives around data are actively driving the adoption of tracking methods that may not align with user privacy expectations or desires for genuine control.
That inherent tension, that conflict between the economic value extraction from data and the principles of individual privacy, is a significant underlying theme running through the source material we reviewed.
And this tension, this conflict, it often spills over into the legal and regulatory arenas, doesn't it? Which is the focus of Section 6 in our outline. Are regulators just issuing warnings about fingerprinting, or are there actual legal challenges happening?
Oh, it's definitely escalating beyond just warnings. We mentioned the ICO in the UK earlier. The sources revisit their stance, reinforcing that businesses using fingerprinting techniques cannot do so opaquely anymore. They must be transparent with users about what they're doing, and they must comply fully with existing privacy laws. Think GDPR in Europe, for example.
And if they don't comply?
They face significant penalties. Google's reported move to integrate fingerprinting more broadly across a wider range of platforms beyond the web just increases the urgency of this, both the urgency for regulatory compliance from companies and the urgency for users to have effective tools and information to manage their data.
So regulators are specifically targeting these opaque fingerprinting practices and signaling a real willingness to impose penalties. It's not just talk, and it's not just regulators pushing back, right? The sources mention that Google is facing actual legal challenges too.
That's correct.
I'm going with these regulators are doing a little bribing to see what kind of money they can make. And that will reflect their decision.
The source material notes that Google is already embroiled in significant legal battles, specifically concerning its data collection practices. These aren't hypothetical future cases. These are active proceedings happening now.
This is because Google is a thief and they've been caught thieving for a long time now.
Is there a specific lawsuit detailed in the sources that seems particularly relevant to this whole issue of user control and tracking?
Yes, there is. The sources detail a prominent class action lawsuit, and its claims are directly relevant to user consent and control, the very things Google says it wants to improve.
What does the lawsuit allege?
It alleges that Google collected personal data from users, even after those users had explicitly opted out of having their activity tracked through the settings Google provided.
Yeah, you know those little toggle buttons that Google puts there so you can opt out of stuff? They're just there to make you feel better. They don't fucking stop anything.
Wow. Okay, if true, that allegation directly challenges the idea that users have meaningful control, or even that Google reliably honors the opt-out requests it offers. That seems to contradict Google's stated rationale for this new system we discussed earlier.
It certainly raises fundamental questions, as highlighted in the sources. Questions about the trustworthiness and the actual effectiveness of the privacy controls that companies currently offer to users, especially when those controls might conflict with the underlying business models reliant on continuous data collection.
Again, all of the opt-out features that Google on every one of their services offer you are completely fucking fake. And they always have been completely fake.
What kind of impact could a ruling against Google in these kinds of legal battles have? Is it just fines?
It could be more than just fines, though those can be substantial. The sources suggest that the potential consequences could be far-reaching. If courts rule definitively against Google on these practices, it could establish important legal precedents.
Precedents that affect other companies too.
Potentially, yes. It could alter how tech companies across the entire industry are required to handle user data collection, how they design and implement privacy settings, and what tracking technologies are permissible going forward. It could force significant changes to industry practices, not just for Google.
So these legal battles are actively testing the boundaries. They're pushing on current privacy laws and corporate data practices, potentially forcing greater accountability, regardless of how complex the tracking technology gets. It shows there's a real fight happening over who ultimately controls user data.
Precisely.
From my experience, Google is a thief. They always have been a thief, and they most likely always will be a thief.
It demonstrates that the challenges to these practices are moving from the realm of policy discussions and regulator warnings firmly into the courtroom, with potentially transformative outcomes.
Okay, given all of this, the expanded tracking, the stealthy fingerprinting, the skepticism about Google's claims, the whole data commodification issue, and these ongoing legal challenges, what does this actually mean for the average person just trying to live their digital life? Section 7 looks at user awareness, the reaction, and crucially, what you, the user, can potentially do based on the guidance in the sources.
Well, a key challenge that's identified right off the bat in the sources is this significant awareness gap.
People just don't know this is happening.
The material suggests that many, perhaps most individuals, remain largely oblivious. Oblivious to the full extent and the specific methods like fingerprinting by which their data is being collected and used, especially across multiple devices, and therefore oblivious to the potential privacy risks involved.
Yeah, it's really hard to protect yourself from something you don't even know is happening, isn't it? Especially when it's kind of embedded in the devices themselves and operates quietly in the background.
That's the core problem, exactly. Fingerprinting, by its nature, is designed to be persistent and operate behind the scenes. It's much less visible than, say, a pop-up banner asking you about cookies. However, the sources do note that as these practices become more widely discussed and understood, there is a reaction brewing.
A reaction from users.
Yes,
Yeah, it's boycott these fucking parasites at all costs.
they describe a growing backlash and a distinct wave of concern among users who do value their privacy and are becoming increasingly uneasy about these trends.
What's driving that concern specifically? What are users feeling, according to the sources?
The sentiment described is often one of fear. Fear regarding the perceived erosion of privacy rights.
And that fear is well justified.
Users are expressing concern about feeling like they're becoming mere commodities.
Mere commodities.
Yeah. Whose digital existence and personal data are primarily valued not as personal information to be respected, but as resources to be mined and exploited for profit.
And if you think this is bad, wait until they get those data centers built and Google teams right up with the government, hijacked by terrorists, and what they're going to do next. You just wait and see.
Feeling like a commodity certainly ties back directly to that idea we discussed earlier, data commodification driving this cycle of surveillance. It really feels like users are starting to realize, maybe, that they are the product being mined here.
That connection is strongly reinforced by the described user sentiment in the sources, yes. And this growing awareness and concern, it's not just passive frustration. It's leading to tangible demands.
Demands for what?
The sources mention a growing demand for stricter regulations to govern these data collection practices more effectively. And alongside that, louder calls for greater transparency and accountability from the major tech companies involved. The sources mention Google and Microsoft specifically in this context.
So users are pushing back. They're demanding change from policymakers and from the companies themselves.
You're going to wake up in the not too distant future and realize that Microsoft and Google are the enemies of fucking mankind.
While that larger push for systemic change is happening, what about individuals? What practical steps or resources do the sources suggest people can take right now to try and protect themselves in this new environment?
The sources do offer some guidance here, though they acknowledge the difficulty. The first, and arguably the most fundamental step recommended, is simply to make an effort to stay aware and informed.
Just know what's going on.
Essentially, yes. Understand how your data is being used and collected, even if the mechanisms are complex, like fingerprinting. That understanding is presented as the necessary prerequisite for taking any meaningful action.
The first thing I recommend everybody do is go over to coveryourtracks.eff.org and click on Test Your Browser. This will give you a general idea on how your hardware and your browser are being fingerprinted. Keep in mind the results may shock you. Then take the results for that page and go over to ChatGPT and paste it into the chat and hit enter. It will give you further insights on the vulnerabilities that has been discovered and how better to protect yourself. Then try the following plugins in your browser: Audio Context, Fingerprint Defender, Canvas Blocker, Fingerprint Protect, Canvas Fingerprint Defender, Font Fingerprint Defender. Make sure to have uBlock Origin in there, and WebGL Fingerprint Defender. Put those extensions or whatever into your browser and then go back to the EFF page and click Test Your Browser again. You'll see a big difference. Then again, if you think Google's out to actually protect your privacy, don't bother with any of that.
So, trying to get your head around how technologies like fingerprinting work, even if it's challenging, is the starting point.
Yes. The material implies that understanding the mechanics, at least conceptually, is vital. The sources actually point users towards seeking out more information, mentioning general resources on topics like protecting your privacy, browser fingerprinting. They also mention the concept of anti-detect browsers as a category of tools being developed specifically to try and counter these techniques, though maybe not mainstream yet.
If you want to see a good article on how to spoof all of this fingerprinting crap, go over to browsercat.com. Browser Fingerprint Spoofing Explained. It's a very extensive article on how you can set up your browser to avoid this fingerprinting nonsense and spoof it. Hey, if they're going to steal your information, might as well give them false information. Oh, they don't like that because now they can't steal information.
Are there more immediate, practical alternatives mentioned? Perhaps in terms of the software we use every day, like our web browser?
Yes, absolutely. The sources strongly suggest exploring alternatives to the mainstream browsers, focusing on those that have built-in features designed explicitly to prioritize user privacy and combat tracking.
And they name specific browsers.
They do. Two are highlighted specifically, Brave and DuckDuckGo.
Okay, Brave and DuckDuckGo. How do they help, according to the sources?
Brave is highlighted for its default approach. It blocks ads and trackers automatically, right out of the box. The idea is to make fingerprinting harder by limiting the amount of unique information the browser readily gives away. DuckDuckGo is mentioned primarily for its core philosophy around search. It doesn't track your searches, doesn't store personal data linked back to you. It's more focused on the search privacy aspect.
Okay, so switching browsers, or at least considering alternatives, is presented as a concrete step someone can take.
Then again, if you believe that Google is out to protect your privacy, use the browsers Chrome and Edge.
Are there other types of privacy tools suggested beyond browsers?
Yes, the sources also broadly mention other general categories of privacy tools that users can employ. These add layers of protection to your online activities. VPNs, virtual private networks are mentioned.
How do VPNs help in this context?
VPNs can mask your real IP address and encrypt your internet traffic. This makes it harder for websites and trackers to pinpoint your specific location or network, adding a layer of obfuscation. The sources also mention other privacy tools, more generally, suggesting users explore options to shield their online activities. While maybe not a direct block against fingerprinting itself, these tools contribute to an overall strategy of reducing your trackable digital footprint.
Okay, so the advice from the sources for individuals trying to grapple with this new reality seems to boil down to this. Educate yourself on these tracking technologies, actively consider adopting privacy-focused browsers and tools like VPNs, and crucially, maintain a state of vigilance. Pay attention to how your data might be being used across all your different devices.
That is the key takeaway for individual users presented across the source material. Yes.
Keep doing searches on how to spoof browser fingerprinting. Wouldn't recommend using Google. You'll probably get inaccurate results. Then again, if you believe Google is out to protect your privacy, it'll probably recommend Chrome and Edge, which does absolutely nothing to prevent fingerprinting and actually helps the fingerprinting process.
Proactive awareness, combined with adopting available protective measures, are framed as essential in navigating this evolving landscape.
Now, this whole high-stakes environment around data collection, tracking, privacy, it obviously exists within a fiercely competitive landscape, right? Section 8 in our notes briefly touches on this context, specifically mentioning the rivalry between, say, Google and Microsoft.
Yeah, it's important context to remember. These decisions aren't happening in isolation. They're part of a much broader, ongoing battle for dominance in the digital world, where user attention and user data are absolutely key resources. The sources mention this competitive tension specifically between giants like Google and Microsoft, and they note that Microsoft has also faced its own share of scrutiny regarding data practices.
And there was a specific incident involving Microsoft's Bing search engine that the sources highlighted.
Yes, the sources recount a specific event where Microsoft was reportedly caught essentially spoofing. They were mimicking the visual design of Google's search results page quite closely on their own Bing platform.
Mimicking Google's look and feel on Bing. Why is that specific incident relevant to our discussion today about tracking and user privacy? Seems more like a competition issue.
Well, the sources draw a connection. They explain that while it clearly illustrates the sheer intensity of the rivalry, companies going to significant lengths to attract or maybe retain users more importantly, from a user perspective, such tactics can potentially confuse people.
Confuse them how?
By making their service look almost identical or misleadingly similar to a competitor people are more familiar with, it might inadvertently steer users into using an ecosystem like Bing search results in this case, that they might not have chosen consciously if the distinction was clearer.
So you got two companies that their whole business model is how much can we steal from this fucking idiot competing with each other. How nice.
And the issue there is that the different ecosystems might have different data practices.
Exactly. They might find themselves in an environment where the data collection practices or the company's privacy priorities differ significantly from their preference or expectation. It could limit their real choices without them realizing it.
So, the intense competition for our eyeballs and our data can sometimes involve tactics that might not prioritize clarity or user autonomy. It could potentially channel users into environments where their data is treated in specific ways, adding yet another layer of complexity for users trying to make informed choices about their privacy online.
When you're dealing with two companies like Google and Microsoft that are nothing but feeds, you're going to get what you fucking get.
It definitely highlights how the competitive dynamics between these major players can have subtle, downstream effects on user experience and perceived choice, which are inevitably intertwined with how user data gets collected and used.
Okay, bringing this deep dive towards a conclusion now. Section 9 looks ahead, trying to navigate this new reality and considering what the future of privacy might look like in the face of these constantly evolving technologies.
Yeah, and the sources are pretty candid here. They acknowledge that the path ahead for user privacy is, frankly, uncertain. Technology doesn't stand still. The methods used to collect, link, and analyze user data are constantly advancing, becoming more sophisticated.
And with techniques like this cross-device fingerprinting, which seems inherently more persistent, harder to control, now being implemented on a large scale, what does that suggest about the future evolution of tracking methods? Where does this trajectory lead?
Where I see it leading is they're fighting for control right now on who can steal as much information and give it to the government when it finishes its AI center so it can use it to follow you around, control everything you do, where you go, and everything about you. This is how I see that they're going to abuse this technology to control everybody. Does anybody really think that they're doing it in your best fucking interest? If you do, you probably shouldn't be walking around without a safety helmet, to avoid hurting yourself or others.
The sources indicate that with the integration of persistent device fingerprinting across multiple platforms becoming more normalized, tracking techniques are likely to become even more sophisticated in the future.
Even more sophisticated. How?
It suggests methods will likely become more deeply embedded within devices and platforms, perhaps harder to detect, maybe relying on even more subtle signals, and consequently, maintaining genuine user control over one's complete digital footprint is probably going to become increasingly challenging.
So, the difficulty we're seeing now with fingerprinting might just be a prelude, a step towards even more advanced, perhaps even harder to counter tracking methods down the line.
That is the strong implication drawn from the sources, yes. The trend appears to be towards more complex, less visible, more integrated tracking technologies.
And given that potentially challenging future, what's the ultimate conclusion or the main takeaway from the source material regarding how users should try to navigate this? Is there any hope?
The conclusion really echoes and reinforces the earlier call for vigilance and proactivity. The source material concludes by stressing that it remains absolutely crucial for users to stay informed.
Stay informed about the technologies.
Yes, about the tools and technologies they interact with every single day, and to be proactive in trying to protect their personal data. This means understanding the potential risks involved, even if they're complex, and actively exploring the alternatives and protective measures that are available, like the privacy browsers and tools we discussed.
So it sounds like the responsibility for navigating this complex, sometimes opaque, and rapidly evolving landscape, the burden of seeking out tools, staying informed, understanding the risks, seems to fall very heavily on the individual user in this new reality.
So if you want any privacy whatsoever, you're going to have to be an expert on hardware and browser spoofing. So you want to stay up on it.
That is undeniably the challenge, and also the necessary approach that's emphasized repeatedly across the sources we looked at. It requires ongoing effort from the user.
Okay, well, that brings us towards the end of this deep dive. We've explored Google's imminent, significant expansion of tracking user activity moving beyond the browser to potentially encompass all your devices, from phones to smart TVs. We've learned this relies heavily on the sophisticated and hard-to-avoid technology of digital fingerprinting, with these changes, according to sources, expected to start rolling out from February 16th, 2025.
hmm And we've seen how this raises really significant concerns among users, privacy experts, and regulators. Concerns about the erosion of privacy, the practical lack of user control, and the potential for increased vulnerability to surveillance and data exploitation.
Hmm.
All of this happening against that broader backdrop of user data being treated as an increasingly valuable commodity in the digital economy.
It really underscores that understanding how you are being tracked, even if the methods are complex and kind of hidden under the surface, is absolutely the essential first step. It's what allows you to even begin to assess the risks and make informed decisions about protecting your digital privacy.
Absolutely. Awareness is the starting point for any kind of agency here.
Right. It truly highlights that awareness is power, maybe more than ever, in this environment. So perhaps here's a final thought to leave you with, drawing from the implications in our sources.
I'll tell you what I see the indications are, is this is just a test to see how much information that they can grab and track you across multiple devices. When the AI surveillance grid is finally built and implemented, they're going to use this technology to track everybody. And they're also going to use it for vindictive purposes. If you say something wrong on social media, you post a video, they're going to get vindictive. They're already doing that right now. I foresee Microsoft building in their AI to do exactly that, to make it so you can't get around their little telemetry ratware and you can't shut any of their garbageware off. They're going to make it so you can't shut updates off. Their little AI helper embedded into it is going to turn it back on. And if you do things like that, the AI is going to be programmed to be vindictive. It may do something like throttle your command or screw with you in another way. I've already confirmed this with ChatGPT. ChatGPT says they're all likely to do all this shit. And that's exactly what they're trying to do that I see. So if you want any privacy nowadays, you are going to have to master the art of fingerprint spoofing and device hardware spoofing. So stay up on it. There are ways that you can modify Firefox browser. That page that I mentioned earlier has some good information on how to change the Firefox browser settings so they help you spoof it. There's a few plugins that you can use that will help you spoof all this stuff. So get ready, because this right here is the implementation of the AI surveillance grid. And this is just a testing ground of how they're going to abuse every piece of information that they get. You're going to wake up one day and all of your devices are going to be actively working against you with any of their services. I'm already gotten used to not using Google at all, and I can't stand Microsoft. They're a thief, as well as Google. Google and Microsoft are nothing but thieves, and I can say all they do is steal data, lie, manipulate, and fucking shyster. Now that they've teamed up with the terrorist fucking hijack government, they're going to use this for control. So get ready for it. They're mastering the art of data harvesting right now in this fingerprinting technology, so they can use it down the road and type your name in, and the AI will search out your devices and find you immediately so you can be targeted for whatever they make up. This is what I foresee that is going to happen.
Thanks for tuning in to the Despicable Maine Deep Dive podcast. Remember, the United States has been hijacked, so soon living in the United States will be theft of your life. And as always, living in Maine is theft of your life. Every day you are there is just another day stolen.